you have to fight back on this stuff. I don't mind being in battles. I don't mind being engaged in, as I like to say, Donnybrooks from time to time. I don't think you can take this stuff laying down. I don't think you can let the Brookings Institute think, oh, we're just going to create a BS story, and when we call them out on the BS story and ask them to explain it live on the radio and tell them they can come on any day this week, they say they have no time for it. Well, you had time to be interviewed by the New York Times. I will be stunned if the New York Times writer of this piece will come on either. And so they've already laundered their lie. The Brookings Institute does a study. They contact the New York Times, say, we have this study, we want you to write about it. The New York Times says they'll do it. They put it on the front page of the business section. They widely distribute it across the entire internet. They ask Apple and they ask Google for comment on this, providing them a list of all the shows that they believe spread the most misinformation. And by that point, it's all out there. They've gotten the full impact of their story. And when somebody says, wait a minute, what's the there? What is this misinformation that you are claiming exists? There's nothing there. They have laundered a completely BS story, and they have managed to get it widely distributed on the front page of the business section in the New York Times. And if you don't know this show, you may not be able to find us now on Apple and on Google. This is how the game is rigged. This is how they use the big tech algorithms to make themselves the favored party for left-wing ideas. I wanted to start with the Brookings Institute. I don't know a ton about the Brookings Institute. I haven't spent a lot of time focused on them because I have a life and I don't spend very much time focused on think tanks in general because by and large, think tanks are just funded by rich people who want their ideas to get out there and otherwise are not willing to do the work themselves. That's my general proposition on think tanks. So, what is really intriguing, in my opinion, associated with this is the New York Times and the Brookings Institute worked in concert to release a list of the places that most misinformed their audience. And they put this on the front page of the Friday New York Times business. And for all of you out there, you may have heard me talking about this, I believe, on Friday. I said, okay, Buck and I endeavor every single day to be as honest and transparent with you as we can and to get every fact that we have correct. And for those of you who've been listening for the past couple of years, if we find out we got a fact incorrect, we come back and we try to correct it. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between facts and opinions, but opinions are only as good as the facts upon which they are based. So, if you get a fact wrong, it undercuts your own opinion because it's built on a foundation of inaccuracy. That's a very basic explanation for what we try to do. And so, when I saw this story, it did not only mention the Clay and Buck show, it also mentioned the Rush Limbaugh show. And obviously, Rush has been dead for almost 2 years now. And that is a long time for a study to be looking at both Rush Limbaugh's show and our show, not to mention that Rush died in February 2 years ago, and there wasn't any new shows. As you guys well know, they played Best of Rush Limbaugh for months until Buck and I came and started working in this time slot in June of 2021. So my first thought was, how in the world are they tying Rush's show into our show? And my second thought, because that's a long time frame, my second thought was, what in the world are they classifying as misinformation? And so when I was reading the New York Times front page in the business section Friday edition, they said researchers at Brookings downloaded and transcribed 36,603 podcast episodes from 79 political talk shows that had been released before January 22nd of 2022. So this is the very definition, not only, I believe, of fake news, but also old news. So they are looking at shows that were released before January 22nd of 2022. So that's a strange standard. That means, for instance, for our show, they only used at most 6 months of this radio program. But I went on Friday and I said, look, I want to know what you have classified as misinformation. What is out there, Brookings Institute, that you believe we are being dishonest about? And I would like for you to come on and explain what exactly we did that was misinformation. We were number 3 on the misinformation list. Steve Bannon, to his credit, number 1 overall. We were number 3. And so we sent an email. I read you that email yesterday. Brookings Institute finally got back to us last night and said they are, quote, not available for an interview. Well, wait a minute. We offered them any day this week. Said we will make time for you and your lead researcher or any other communications expert at the Brookings Institute who is familiar with your findings, which you released directly to the New York Times, and the New York Times immediately put on the front page of their business section in the Friday edition of the newspaper, widely distributed, had a graphic with Clay and Buck up there. It's called as top purveyors of misinformation. And we said, you can come on any day this week. You can speak to our audience, biggest radio audience in the country. If you believe that we are spreading misinformation, you have an opportunity to directly confront us right in front of this entire audience and explain what we've been sharing that's misinformation. They said, and I quote, they are not available for an interview at all. So this is important, right? We get attacked on this program for spreading misinformation. Our response is to immediately say, okay, you made this attack. You made this criticism. You are welcome to come on this program and explain what misinformation you have found. And this is important because I would venture that much of the, quote, misinformation that they found from over a year ago was us on this program saying, hey, the data is reflecting that the COVID shot doesn't prevent or stop transmission of COVID. Because that's something that we were certainly saying in the summer of 2021 when almost no one else was saying it. That was considered misinformation then. It's now 100% conventional wisdom. In other words, it's important to point out when misinformation is not misinformation at all. It's just inconveniently ahead of what the public narrative is. And I want to continue to hammer this home because this unholy alliance between the Brookings Institute and the New York Times is an important signpost for what's going on here. Because this article, which is written by the New York Times, which was based on information that the Brookings Institute is unwilling or unable to provide to us, it is designed to try to attack this program and keep us from being widely distributed on podcast. Listen to the paragraph that I'm going to read you from the New York Times article. The findings underscore the vital role Apple, Google, and a constellation of podcast apps play in connecting disinformation peddlers to their audience. This article is designed to put pressure on Apple, Google, everyone who shares the Clay and Buck podcast, because we are spreading disinformation. We are disinformation peddlers, according to the New York Times. Now, what does that mean? What's a disinformation peddler? What have we actually said that's untrue? Well, the Brookings Institute won't tell us. By the way, we should reach out, Allie. Let's reach out to Stuart A. Thompson, the article author at the New York Times business section. Stuart A. Thompson. Let's invite Stuart A. Thompson to come on at the New York Times and explain why and how we are disinformation peddlers and what his goal was when he said Apple, Google, and a constellation of podcast apps have to take aim at these disinformation peddlers. Also said that there were much criticism for misinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines. Big tech companies have taken a largely hands-off approach to podcast content and avoiding the kind of scrutiny that has dogged social networks for years. The companies say they have little responsibility for podcast content because they are effectively search engines connecting listeners to shows but never hosting content. The companies have policies that ban hateful language or content that might incite violence, but researchers said those policies were vague and poorly enforced, allowing false content to spread. I'm going to keep hammering this home because I think it's important. I'm going to open up phone lines 800-282-2882. Continue to read from this New York Times article because it's important for all of you to understand that this show is being attacked because of the massive influence that we have. And it's being attacked in a way that is so fundamentally dishonest that the people who are doing the attack won't even support any of the attacks that they are levying against us. I'll take your calls on this, but I think it's important to take you guys behind the curtain and explain exactly what's going on and how this show is basically a canary in a coal mine for what is happening in the larger ecosystem of news, discussion, of political talk in general. This is really, really important because it goes to the essence of whether we have a free and fair discussion surrounding this country at all. Taking you behind the scenes for what attacks on this program look like, how they are designed, how dishonest they are, how quickly people like the Brookings Institute and the New York Times run and hide when you ask them to stand behind whatever they're saying. I'll go on anywhere. Now, I'm banned on CNN. I'm banned on ESPN. But I would go on CNN. I would go on MSNBC. I will stand up for what I believe in because I'm not afraid of being attacked for what I believe in. These people attack you. They use their propaganda outlets, and then when you give them an opportunity to actually explain themselves, they won't do it because the rig job is not a fair fight. I'm reading from the New York Times. This is the crux of what they're trying to do. Apple and Google software connects to listeners with podcasts using an algorithm that surfaces recommended shows. Ivy Choi, a spokeswoman for Google, said the company did not recommend shows through its algorithm if they contain, quote, harmful misinformation. What is harmful misinformation? Well, because of this Brookings Institute story, the Clay and Buck show contains harmful misinformation. What is that harmful misinformation? No one will tell us, but it gives the cover to Google to keep people from coming across this podcast and experiencing the opinions that are shared here. This is how rig jobs work. A spokesman for Apple declined to comment. So the New York Times, citing the Brookings Institute, reaches out to Google and Apple, says these shows, including Clay and Buck, are harmful spreaders of misinformation, and tries to immediately put pressure on those podcast companies not to allow you to find this show. That's how the game works. That's how they rig things so that their chosen forms of information, which, by the way, think Joe Biden is the greatest president who's ever lived, coincidentally, and that Democrats are the greatest party that has ever existed, receive preferential treatment so their ideas in the marketplace of ideas are more easily disseminated. So that your kids and your grandkids who may not know this show exists because they don't listen to radio very much can't get exposed to the ideas that we are trying to share on our podcast. That's how the sausage is made. It's a huge rig job rooted in dishonesty. They are accusing us of misinformation. I invite them on the program to explain exactly what they mean, but the gig is already up. Apple and Google are already coming after this show because of this study, which has no basis in truth, which the New York Times propagated based on a Brookings Institute rig job. Open phone lines, 800-282-2882. I think it's important for all of you to understand how dirty, nasty, and filled with lies the media game is. That's why I'm taking you behind the curtain. How does it come to pass that we in this program, which you listen to every single day, are labeled the third biggest purveyor of misinformation in the entire political realm? How does that happen? You listen to us every day. You might not agree with every opinion that we have. Certainly you shouldn't, because you all have functional brains yourselves, and really the only person you should agree with all the time on everything is yourself. And even you should question your own opinions. I do it every day. I'm willing to accept that I might be wrong as new data comes in. That's what an intelligent person does. But when you see a rig job, make no mistake, this is laundered rig job. The Brookings Institute is a left-wing organization that doesn't like the things that we say on this program. So they have raised tens of millions of dollars from left-wing donors. They claim that they ran a study that found that we have 15 different misinformation elements per show, I think was the way they defined it, whatever it was. Third most in all of politics. And when we reach out to the Brookings Institute, we say, hey, what misinformation are we actually spreading? Can you come on and explain your study? We're any day this week will allow you to come on and have a forum. If you truly care about misinformation, what you would want to do, I think, is confront people like me who are huge spreaders of misinformation and be able to speak directly to our audience about how you're all being hoodwinked and I'm a huge liar and you guys are being played for fools. That's what the Brookings Institute story tells us. So we offered for them to come on. They won't do it. We got an offer to the New York Times author of this article to come on. They won't do it because they've already laundered their claim. They've already got Google and Apple likely adjusting the algorithm so many people will not be able to be exposed to this podcast because they have managed to put out the lie that we are harmful purveyors of disinformation, that we are making American democracy fall apart because of what we say on this program, and therefore Apple and Google are complicit in our lies if they allow you to find our product there. This is how they use the media to come after shows like this. They set up their algorithms and they set up their rig jobs so that we effectively are playing in a game where the officials have already been bought off in favor of the opposing team. Sorry, Bengals fans. Sorry, Eagles fans, if you recently felt that way when you were playing the Chiefs. And sorry to everybody who's been playing the New England Patriots for much of the past 20 years as well. That's effectively what's going on here. We have officials who claim to be nonpartisan, focused on the sanctity of democracy, that are making up false allegations, that are trying to come after this show because they don't like what we say here because we're a threat to their power. And so they are coming after us with rig jobs. A lot of you want to weigh in on what I've been sharing so far. Let's go down to Dustin in Florida. Dustin, appreciate you listening. What you got for us?
Hey, Clay, thanks for having me on, man. You guys have a great show.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so I kind of have a little bit of a question. I know you're an attorney, or were an attorney. I don't know if you ever handled defamation suits or anything like that, but because where is the gray area or that break point of where somebody could publish a lie, okay,
Yep.
or even what they say is a fact that's unprovable, so much to the point where it sways opinion and cuts into your ultimate bottom line. If you guys can prove over the next few months that this article has changed algorithms and cost you guys, let's just say, millions, I mean, is there some kind of liable suit that you guys can do against Brookings or the New York Times for doing that?
It's a fascinating question. And there's actually thank you for the call. There's actually a Supreme Court case about this, I believe on the 21st of this month, and we're going to talk about it on this program as it gets a little closer. But the essence of that case is they are arguing that big tech companies should be liable for the results of their algorithms. And I think it's such an important thing out there that is not getting a lot of discussion, because a lot of times these big tech companies, when you criticize them, they fall back and say, well, that's not a decision we're making. That's our algorithm. But the algorithm is manipulated and designed by humans to produce the results that the humans want to see the algorithm produced. So the idea that the algorithm isn't somehow not an editorial decision, in my opinion, is wrong. The algorithm is directly determined based on what it produces to be the best version of that product. So if Apple wanted to create, I'm just tossing it out, Apple or Google, if Apple or Google wanted to create an algorithm that consistently showed that Clay and Buck was the number one radio show in America and that more people should listen to it, they could do that. If they wanted to create an algorithm that said less people should listen to Clay and Buck because they are harmful purveyors of misinformation, they could do that as well. They are all powerful in these big tech companies. Now, many of you are listening to radio stations right now, and we love our radio affiliates. But as audio is evolving, the way that you find new shows, certainly your kids and grandkids, is through the algorithm of what they might see when they go on to, let's say, for instance, the Apple iTunes store, or they go on Google and look for shows that they find to be particularly appealing. And what's going on here is, based on laundered disinformation from the Brookings Institute and from Apple and Google, they are trying to create systems by which their opinions and their stories and their political beliefs are favored over a show like this. And that is, I believe, a serious threat that very few people out there are aware of. And certainly that isn't talked about very much. And I particularly am exposed to it because when I ran Outkick, I would see how the algorithm changes at Facebook or Google or Twitter could drastically impact our overall audience, which, to the caller's point, directly impacts our bottom line. We make far less money when the algorithms disfavor us than we would in a natural full competition. And effectively what's going on here is our show is having to compete with, like, we're in a marathon and we have a 100-pound weight on our backs that we are having to carry. Meanwhile, these left-wing shows are actually being able to use bikes, right? Like we're trudging along in a race with a 100-pound weight on our backs for our ideas. And then the left-wingers, they give them bikes and or scooters. And they're like, hey, just have at it. Carl, also in Florida. What's up, Carl?
Thanks for having me on. I really love the show.
Appreciate it.
As soon as you started talking about a study, just from dealing with Fauci, you got to follow the money. So I Googled who funds the Brookings Institute, and I don't know who the BHP group is in Germany, but Bill Gates comes up number 2. So you know why you're on the list, and you should wear that as a badge of courage, because This is all going back to COVID.
That is,
and we appreciate your being very clear. And
thank you for the call. And these things are big, by the way. In 2020, Brookings Institute had almost $100 million in revenue from donors. It has an endowment, according to this research group I'm looking at right now, of $355 million. And so the overall impact of this is, and your point is a good one, these elites use these think tanks to launder their ideas into public and attack people who are their critics. So instead, look, if Bill Gates wanted to come out and he say, I think Clay Travis and Buck Sexton are horrible human beings. They have the worst show ever. I mean, I'd welcome him on the show to make that case. He can own his opinion. I don't have any issue with him. But what happens when you get super wealthy is you don't actually make the attack yourself. You find somebody else to do it. And that's what's going on here. David in Scottsdale, Arizona. I had an awesome time out in Scottsdale over the past several days, David. Got a great town. Appreciate you calling the show.
Hey, Clay. The thing that is never asked these people is the what question. What is their definition of misinformation, disinformation? Because it's most likely going to be subjective terms. And subjective terms are nothing more like than an editorial board. It's kind of meaningless.
You're exactly right. That's why I want them to come on the show. And not only that, and thank you for the call, this study ended in January of 2022. So just think about all the things that have occurred that might have been considered misinformation in July and August when we said them that are now commonplace and understood to be true. For instance, we said masks don't work. We said that the COVID shot doesn't stop you from getting or spreading COVID. Those things are now, to a large extent, commonly understood, that every school needed to be open and we weren't saving people's lives by shutting down schools and that we were harming kids. Well, in July and August of 2021, when Buck and I were saying that on this program, I guarantee you the Brookings Institute went in and was like, oh, that's misinformation. Now it's commonly understood to have been true, but they labeled it as misinformation. I think that's why they won't come on and why they won't share the metrics under which they have actually accused us of spreading misinformation. Because their entire study is BS, but it doesn't matter because the New York Times wrote about it, and because now Google and Apple are on the hook because they then got a request for comment from the New York Times, and then they panicked and they're like, oh my goodness, what do we do now? And the answer is, I bet we are going to be, if we haven't already been, massively discredited in the overall podcast rankings and algorithms because of this story, which is 100% BS. Laying out the dirty rigged game that we play and how they try to come after this show, claiming that we are misinformation peddlers while actually engaging in misinformation. And when you ask them to just come on and explain, hey, what are you guys actually doing? They won't be and aren't willing to do it. That's, I think, what Brad in Florida wants to weigh in on. And hey, here's the lesson before I go to Brad in Florida. Here's the lesson of what has to happen. You have to fight back on this stuff. I don't mind being in battles. I don't mind being engaged in, as I like to say, Donniebrooks from time to time. I don't think you can take this stuff laying down. I don't think you can let the Brookings Institute think, oh, we're just going to create a BS story, and when we call them out on the BS story and ask them to explain it live on the radio and tell them they can come on any day this week, they say they have no time for it. Well, you had time to be interviewed by the New York Times. I will be stunned if the New York Times writer of this piece will come on either. And so they've already laundered their lie. The Brookings Institute does a study. They contact the New York Times, say, we have this study, we want you to write about it. The New York Times says they'll do it. They put it on the front page of the business section. They widely distribute it across the entire internet. They ask Apple and they ask Google for comment on this, providing them a list of all the shows that they believe spread the most misinformation. And by that point, it's all out there. They've gotten the full impact of their story. And when somebody says, wait a minute, what's the there? What is this misinformation that you are claiming exists? There's nothing there. They have laundered a completely BS story, and they have managed to get it widely distributed on the front page of the business section in the New York Times. And if you don't know this show, you may not be able to find us now on Apple and on Google. This is how the game is rigged. This is how they use the big tech algorithms to make themselves the favored party for left-wing ideas. We got in Florida right now. Let me see. I forgot his name. Brad in Florida. What you got for me?
Hey, Clay. Yeah, it's the MO of the left. They accuse the right of doing what they're doing. Their media partners help get the word out, and then everybody goes away and won't defend their point, and then you're left, like you are, having to bring this to everybody's attention. And it's just typical. And the irony is the purveyors of misinformation are the ones that are providing the misinformation at this point.
Thank you for the call. It's perfectly said. And there is no equivalent of this on the right, by the way. Right? I mean, where would it even get distributed? Let's pretend that I had the money to fund this huge, massive think tank to launder this BS idea that I have. Who would publish it? Who would go to Google and Apple and say, oh, these far left-wing podcasts are spreading misinformation? The biggest purveyors of misinformation in the world right now, in America anyway, are the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, they are rife with misinformation. Everything they wrote about Trump for years, basically wrong. They haven't accepted responsibility for it. Instead, they're continuing to argue that anyone who disagrees with them, which would be this show, that we're the actual purveyors of misinformation.